The global system is currently paralyzed by a fundamental bug. We are looking at the immediate aftermath of the United States and Israel's physical removal of Iran's supreme leader, and instead of achieving the intended system reset, we have stagnation. The US merely triggered a closed-loop defense mechanism, and that violent spike we are seeing, crude oil tearing past $111 per barrel, that is not a celebratory market reaction. It is a repair bill. The Middle East has historically functioned as a massive toilet of vested interests, and right now it is entirely clogged. The power resource is suffering from historical constipation. Instead of circulating, it is pooling in one bloodline.
You cannot just reduce the dismantling of an authoritarian terror state to a clinical debugging failure. We're talking about the physical liberation of millions of oppressed citizens. The elimination of a central node of terror is a structural necessity for long-term global stability. Whatever immediate market friction you see on a spreadsheet, the United States military action executed a highly necessary, albeit painful, step for the eventual democratization of the region.
Your reliance on traditional, emotional geopolitical sentiment completely ignores the mathematical reality of resource circulation. The existing operating system relies on accumulation. The global public is currently being forced to pay the massive survival costs of this hereditary monopoly.
The spike to $111 per barrel is a small, temporary price to pay for the removal of a systemic threat that has destabilized the region for decades. You have to look at the physical reality of geopolitical intervention. When you surgically remove the absolute apex of an authoritarian regime, you introduce a fatal disruption into their command and control. The ensuing volatility in the energy markets is simply the cost of doing business when opening a repressed market.
The surgical strike was a complete debugging failure. The existing capitalism model operates on the deeply flawed premise of market opening through destruction. They assumed breaking the physical infrastructure would force the market open, but Iran simply booted up a backup. Khamenei Jr., this is the worst hereditary update in modern geopolitical history. The power structure did not collapse.
That continuity is a facade. They can project stability to the international community, but the foundation of the regime.
The United States spent billions of dollars, mobilized global military assets to blow up a McDonald's. And the only result was a son opening a Khamenei Burger in the exact same spot the next morning. They are serving the exact same Khamenei classic. The sign on the building changed, but they boldly declared they will continue business. The existing capitalist operating system failed to liquidate the monopoly, and now the entire world is paying the overhead costs of this family business through inflated energy prices.
The regime can hang whatever new shine they want on the door. The foundation of the building is irreparably cracked. Tough physical intervention works, and we have the historical precedent to prove it. Look at the successful application of maximum pressure by the Trump administration against Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro. By physically isolating and threatening the apex leadership, by freezing the assets of their state-run oil company, the United States successfully removed the impurity in the system. Replacing the supreme leader in Iran creates massive internal friction.
You are misdiagnosing a simple replacement of the broken part as a systemic collapse. There is no systemic destruction here.
The Revolutionary Guard now has to manage a sudden, unvetted succession crisis while under the most intense external pressure in their history. This physical friction will inevitably lead to the collapse of the regime. The internal factions will tear each other apart, fighting for the scraps of that family business, leading to the ultimate liberation of the Iranian market.
The United States simply funded an unimaginably expensive succession party. The closed loop of the bloodline reconnected instantly. Circular capitalism dictates that resources must flow and redistribute to create value. But our existing geopolitical operating system allows for total accumulation by a monopolistic entity. When the US physically deleted the previous leader, the energy, the power, and the capital simply bypassed the destroyed node and flowed directly into Mojtaba, the new identical backup.
Destroying the top tier of leadership cripples the regime's infrastructure by severing the localized patronage networks.
You are completely ignoring the economic holding companies that fund the Revolutionary Guard.
When the supreme leader falls, the localized commanders who control the construction headquarters and the bonyads, the supposed charitable trusts that actually hoard the nation's wealth, they lose their central arbiter. they will inevitably turn on one another because the central authority that mediated their resource hoarding is gone.
You are projecting a democratic dividend onto a system that has completely inoculated itself against external physical trauma. You assume the bonyads require a specific individual to function. They require a mechanism of accumulation, which the backup provides flawlessly.
The regime cannot survive purely by turning inward. They are facing absolute isolation. The Iranian economy is cut off from the global financial system. They are locked out of SWIFT, their maritime shipping is under total embargo, their currency is in freefall, and they are on the brink of total macroeconomic ruin. The old system of relentless economic and military pressure will work because the regime no longer has the internal legitimacy or the external revenue streams to pacify its population. They cannot simply run a closed-loop economy when their primary export is choked off from the global market. The friction is too high, the internal pressure cooker will explode, because
Your assumption of isolation completely ignores the hidden mechanics of global resource flow. Iran is not isolated. It is an important collateral property being aggressively protected by cold-blooded debt collectors.
debt collectors who are fundamentally risk-averse. Beijing and Moscow will not risk secondary U.S. sanctions on their primary financial institutions to save a collapsing regime in Tehran.
Russia and China are not acting out of ideological friendship. Under the strict assessment of circular capitalism, their intervention is a calculated investment to maintain the resource clog. They are stepping in as cold-blooded debt collectors to ensure their collateral is not liquidated by the United States. Rather than taking the risk of frontline combat, China and Russia are lending bats, weapons, and maps, information behind the scenes.
Providing satellite imagery and a few air defense components does not fix an inflation rate soaring past 60%. It does not put food on the table for the Iranian public, who are actively watching their purchasing power evaporate.
They provide exactly what is needed to maintain the stagnation. China and Russia would be deeply troubled if they skip town out of nowhere. Iran serves as a massive, heavily armed anti-US fortress in the Middle East. If that fortress falls, the geopolitical debt goes unpaid. So they are sneaking cup noodles and cash through the back door to keep the frozen old regime alive.
Cup noodles and cash do not substitute for legitimate GDP. A few smuggled shipments do not equate to a sustainable macroeconomic model.
China utilizes its dark fleet of unmarked oil tankers to purchase Iranian crude at a steep discount, bypassing the US dollar entirely. Russia integrates Iranian banking systems with its own alternative to SWIFT. This collusion forms a huge dam of vested interests that stops global resource circulation dead in its tracks. The resources do not flow to the Iranian people, and they do not flow to the global market. They pool against this dam, controlled entirely by this trio of monopolies.
Marginal clandestine support, they cannot replace the massive shortfall of legitimate global trade. The sheer weight of the sanctions, combined with the loss of their foundational leader, leaves the regime hollowed out. The $111 oil price is a temporary market fluctuation. It is driven by algorithmic panic in the commodities markets, not a permanent structural deficit. We have seen this exact pattern before, during the initial phases of the Ukraine conflict and previous Gulf tensions.
You are falsely categorizing a permanent structural freeze as a temporary fluctuation. The US strike was a precision-guided invitation to world war.
That is an absurd escalation of the data. The US and Israel executed a highly targeted, localized operation specifically to avoid a broader regional war.
The historical parallel is not Venezuela. The historical parallel is the 1939 invasion of Poland. Under the guise of regime refreshment, the United States attempted to smash the clog of vested interests with kinetic force. But instead of freeing the market, it set fire to the wallets of the entire global population. The missile that eliminated the supreme leader did not ring the bell of freedom. It acted as the dinner bell of vested interests, summoning Russia and China directly to the table as debt collectors.
They were already at the table. China has been buying illicit Iranian oil for years. Russia has been utilizing Iranian drones in Eastern Europe for years. This strike did not create that relationship. It merely exposed the vulnerability of the regime they are trying to prop up. Once the initial shock subsides and the inevitable internal fracturing of the regime accelerates, the global oil markets will stabilize. OPEC has the spare capacity to offset the disruption. Democracy will take root because the old dictatorial infrastructure simply can't afford to maintain its massive internal security apparatus. The dam you speak of cannot hold back the total economic collapse of the regime.
The United States blew a massive hole in the wall of the Middle East, and Russia and China immediately poured concrete into it. They have turned that hole into a convenient fuel filler neck for their own geopolitical and economic agendas. The world's populations are now absorbing an unexploded ordnance called inflation. China treats the Iranian economy as a clearance sale of a bankrupt entity. Russia secures a southern bulwark against American military expansion, ensuring that U.S. resources remain bogged down in the Persian Gulf.
You cannot ignore the human element in this equation. You are treating the citizens of Iran as passive variables in a resource algorithm. They have been given a physical demonstration that their oppressors are not invincible. This is the catalyst. Even if Russia and China attempt to prop up the new leadership with financial lifelines, the psychological barrier of the regime's invulnerability has been shattered. The destruction of the old regime's apex leader creates a massive vacuum of legitimacy that no amount of smuggled cash or discounted oil can fill. The population will no longer accept the hereditary transfer of their nation's wealth. The physical friction generated by this strike is the necessary prerequisite for systemic liberation. The people will demand that those resources flow back into their communities, and the system will be forced to open, however painfully, because
The debugging attempt by the United States has catastrophically failed, resulting in a decades-long freeze on global resource circulation. The existing operating system of ownership, accumulation, and the naive belief in market opening through destruction has proven completely bankrupt. It has produced nothing but the forced extraction of wealth from the global public in the form of $111 oil and runaway inflation, simply to fund a hereditary succession. The collapse of the existing geopolitical and economic system is no longer a theoretical projection. It is an inevitable, mathematically verifiable reality playing out in the commodity markets today. Immediately transitioning to the logic of circular capitalism, where resources are structurally mandated to flow rather than accumulate in the hands of vested monopolies, is the only rational investment for survival.